Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. She comes to us from the UK. Her name is Catharine Arnold with an A, Catharine, Arnold. And she published a book in 2018, fascinating book, very timely book before this pandemic. The title of her book is Pandemic 1918, Eyewitness Accounts from the Greatest Medical Holocaust in Modern History. And we were talking in the pre-show, and it has here in the States 818 five-star reviews. There's an audiobook as well, done by a very professional sounding actor with a brilliant British accent. But Catharine Arnold this is not her first book. She has also read or written Bedlam, London and Its Mad, 2008, Necropolis, London and Its Dead, 2008, The Sexual History of London from Roman Londinium to the Swinging City, Lust, Vice, and Desire Across the Ages, published 2011. Underworld London, Crime and Punishment in the Capital City, 2012. Edward VII, The Prince of Wales and the Women He Loved, 2017. And then also her newest book after Pandemic 1918 is published in 2021. Title of that is Globe, Life in Shakespeare's London. And she read English at Girton College, Cambridge, and she holds a further degree in psychology. She is a journalist, academic, and popular historian, and was formerly in 2018 and 19 the Sheriff of Nottingham. So that's pretty fascinating, something that goes back to the 15th century. So Catharine Arnold, thank you for agreeing to the interview. I really appreciate you spending time to talk about this book.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks for asking me.
So for people who may not have heard your name here in the States, can you kind of talk about, you have a long writing history. Can you talk about your background and what led you to make those steps to write this book, Pandemic 1918?
Yes. In the case of Pandemic 1918, it was something I'd wanted to write about for the longest time. When I was growing up, my parents had quite an unusual marriage. My father was a lot older than my mother, like a generation older. And he always said that he had lost his own parents in the Spanish flu pandemic. And I thought this was strange. And as I grew older, I tried to get him to talk about it because, after all, I was a budding historian. And I thought this has got to be an interesting thing. And it's an interesting part of our family story. But he was so traumatized about it, I later realized that he would not discuss it at all. And he passed on a kind of intergenerational trauma. It was as if what had happened to his own parents, who had died when he was very young. He was just a baby, really. This formed his whole life. And when I started to research this book, and then when I used to give lectures about it and talks in the days before the pandemic, when you could, I encountered dozens of other people with a similar background whose families had been shaken by this unspoken and ghastly thing. In a way, it was similar to the Holocaust in that generations were influenced by this awful way in which their predecessors had died. And I think that's the secret to the fact that not many people talk about Spanish flu. It's only in the last 10 years or so that Spanish flu studies as an academic school have really developed. The whole pandemic, the whole event was subsumed with such massive horror that the generations which followed were very, very reluctant to discuss it or really to examine it in any depth. So the reason I came to write about it in a long-winded way was that background. It was always knowing that it was something that had affected my father's life and in a way my own life profoundly. For instance, on his side of the family, we had no relatives. My schoolmates would be like, oh yes, my grand's coming over, or I'm going to stay with my uncle, whatever. Nobody on my father's side. He was an only child, an orphan, and a whole side of his life had just disappeared.
Wow, it's like an emptiness. Yeah, it's really sad.
Yeah. So deep, deep unhappiness, although he attempted to create his own family through friends and through his colleagues. He had kind of an artificial family very successfully in that respect. But subsequently, I talked to other people who'd shared this experience, and they were the same. This odd feeling that something in your life is missing, that whole side of your existence is just not there. So what happened was I was discussing ideas with my agent after, I think it was Globe, because Globe, the Shakespeare book, was published earlier in this country than in the US.
Oh, I see.
And yeah, it's fair enough. And we came up with this idea about writing about the pandemic, about the Spanish flu pandemic, I should say. I was very keen to do it. My agent, Andrew Loney, thought it held a lot of interest for people. This was in 2015, 2016. So I wrote the proposal and I was met with almost a wall of denial. People did not want to know about this. Publishers thought it was grim and chilling, and nobody would want to read a book about a pandemic. You know, what possible interest could that hold? So in this country, I was published by an independent publisher called Michael O'Mara, and they're best known for, forgive me, colouring books for adults and books about Princess Diana. But to do them credit, they decided to take a chance on me, and they said, yeah, this is an interesting book, let's publish it. Then my US publisher, Macmillan, St. Martin's Press, they were very keen to do it. They were all over it. So I did get a bit of interest, but it by no means held the interest that you would have expected, considering the books I'd done before on the history of London.
And I think you said like this turned out to be your most read or most it's captured the most attention of all your other books. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's what's so extraordinary, because it was really a bit off the wall by my standards. I was working in a slightly different way because my previous history books, have been London-centric. I started writing about the history of London at a time when there was an enormous appetite for books about every aspect of London's history. When my first book came out, Necropolis, London and its Dead, in 2006. And when I started to research that, years and years ago now, I was stunned that there was already an appetite for this kind of thing. I went into Waterstones in central London, and there were walls and walls and walls of books about London history. So I thought, obviously, this is something people are going to love. When I started to write about Spanish flu, initially I thought there's enough material to write about Spanish flu in London or even the UK. But Andrew's sort of feeling for it was a global thing. So I really needed to write about it from a global perspective. So that was more of a stretch. But it was interesting because, and I think it's part of the reason it's been successful, I was able to see what was happening with Spanish flu on the different continents, in different cultures. And that when I started comparing it later on with COVID, was of course very illuminating.
No, it's really fascinating. And it's almost like your personal story, the way the approach you took in this book is similar to your story. Personal perspective, people, you mentioned many famous people here in the States and the UK also, and their experiences with this pandemic, which is kind of like a 1-2 punch for humanity, the Great War, and then this follows on this pandemic. Can you talk kind of what happened back in 1918, what preceded it, and what happened during this global event?
Well, yes, and I think the 1-2 punch description is very effective. Let's take it from there. I mean, basically, the world was already in the grip of World War I. It was in the grip of industrial warfare, the biggest war that it had ever known. This war was effectively taking place on all continents, and it involved a lot of troop mobilization and movement of civilians. And so if there was going to be a pandemic, if there was going to be a killer virus, it was only going to be sped up by the constant movement of large bodies of people around the globe. The other effect of the war was that people were run down, their immune systems probably already damaged by deprivation, starvation, all the rest of it. They were damaged, they were vulnerable, they were depressed. In the West, they were run down from lack of resources, lack of food, Zeppelin raids in London, in the US, food shortages, and total anxiety, because certainly in the West, people were losing members of their family daily to the war in one form or another. So it's almost a perfect storm upon which a killer flu virus could predate on the population. So that was some of the background kind of leading up to it.
And what were the kind of symptoms that distinguished this flu from kind of other diseases or maybe even COVID?
Right, to start off with, and some of the doctors at the time noted this, the two odd things about it were that it attacked the young and the healthy, and that it appeared in the spring and summer. Traditionally, the winter flu season is what it says on the tin. It appears in the winter, and it normally picks off the vulnerable, the very old, the very young, people with pre-existing health conditions, people who, say, are suffering from cancer or other serious diseases. What was weird about this kind of flu was that it was attacking the most healthy. So fit young men in army barracks, healthy pregnant young women, these were the people who were dying of it. We know now that basically it was attacking the autoimmune system the same way that HIV does. So the more of a defense your body puts up to this particular flu, which is the H1N1 virus, the worse the outcome is for you as a patient. It's also worth bearing in mind that at that point, although the medical profession kind of understood that a virus was a thing, they didn't know very much about it. It was only really with the invention of the electron microscope in the 1930s and 40s that scientists could get a real handle on what a virus was. Their feeling was that it was bacterial. So they knew it was similar to the killer flus that they'd experienced in the past, but it was affecting people a whole different way. And of course, yes, the symptoms of Spanish flu were the most horrific. And I think this is one of the reasons why people did not want to remember it, because they did not want to think of their loved ones going through things like falling down in the street, vomiting, losing control of their bowels, vicious nosebleeds, gasping for air. It was called air hunger because basically their lungs were filling up with pus, and the oxygen deprivation meant that their skin turned blue in a condition known as heliotrope cyanosis. These were all, hideous things, and you did not want to think, for instance, of your son at the front dying of this. If he was going to die in the war, you wanted to think he died with his boots on, with a gun in his hand. So, in retrospect, this was one of the things that made it so terrible, and probably why my father never wanted to speak about it, because he didn't want to think of his folks dying that way.
Right. So like a really terrible, and you write in your book, they're comparing it to the Black Death, 1348, Great Plague, 1665.
Yeah, doctors, medical doctors in the US, for instance, army doctors were saying, is this a new form of plague? Is this cholera? They were trying to find explanations for it. At the same time, they were trying to treat unimaginable numbers of young men whose bodies were, as one doctor said, piling up like cordwood, like firewood. The hospitals, both civilian and military, were unable to cope with a number of casualties, and they ran out of places to store the bodies. The poor nurses were worked off their feet because they were not only dealing with living patients, but who were almost impossible. There was no cure. They were just trying to make life bearable for the patients, but they're also trying to think of, how many bodies will we wash tonight, and where are we going to store them?
Right. I mean, it almost is like the Black Plague. You wrote about Philadelphia having this problem. So, like, what are we going to put all these? It's incredible to think that happened at a global scale.
Yeah, Philadelphia. They were faced with terrible problems because they did not have enough burial space, and like many other US cities, what they had to do was dig mass graves with, I believe they're called steam hammers, and people would just be wrapped up in a sheet and put in, which is almost medieval. It's a kind of thing that happened to the people in Boccaccio's Decameron in, 13th century Italy, where people were buried like lasagna. But it was the only solution. You couldn't leave the bodies out. and there simply wasn't enough space. So this is what had to be done. In the UK, they did have more burial space because they'd, in the 19th century, built a lot of new graveyards. But even then, they often ran out of priests and celebrants to conduct the funerals. So what would happen in London, for instance, would be the bodies would be placed by the graves in the graveyard, and then the vicar or the Catholic priest would hastily go around each of them, administer a final blessing, a final benediction, sometimes 20 or 30 at a time, and the people would then be buried.
Wow, yeah, it's incredible. And you kind of mentioned earlier this idea of information or what was happening, and it was kind of almost like today where you said there are theories and control and suppression of information. You could talk about how that played into the pandemic of 1918.
Well, there's two ways of looking at this. I mean, one of the things that developed quite early on, especially in the States, was conspiracy theories. So bearing in mind that this happened in the last year of the First World War, people didn't know it was the last year. For all they knew, it could be going on for another decade. Theories began to develop on the East Coast that Spanish flu was actually spread by the Germans. There were rumors that German subs had come up to the East Coast and left virus, files of poison or files of virus around which people could catch. People were told not to take Bayer aspirin because the rumors were that Bayer, originally being a German name, the aspirin was laced with flu in an attempt to kill the US population. None of these conspiracy theories ever gained any credibility, but you can see how, among a desperate nation, they would seize hold.
Right. So it's almost like you kind of see stuff in COVID too. Like you see this information control, understanding these kind of conspiracy views. And how did this particular flu get the name the Spanish flu?
Well, flu obviously is short for influenza. It was called Spanish flu because it was really first identified in Spain. What was happening is in the last year or so of the war, doctors were noticing at the Western Front in France that more and more of the soldiers were falling ill with a particularly bad form of flu or bronchitis. And although there's an expectation that flu could kill, they weren't expecting troops to die in so many numbers. But they had various names for it. The Germans called it Blitzkatar, which I think is wonderful. The French called it La Grippe, which is an old-fashioned French term for flu. But over the course of the early months of 1918, it kind of rolled through France, and then it rolled across the Pyrenees and into Spain. And the Spanish king, Alfonso XIII, contracted it. And so did many members of his court. Alfonso recovered, but it meant that in the Spanish newspapers, they could talk quite openly about this new mysterious flu. Spain was neutral, so they could talk about this killer flu without any worries that they might be affecting the morale of their population. It was a different matter in the UK, where newspapers were instructed to suppress too much discussion of Spanish flu on the grounds that it could affect the morale of the country. This was under what's called the Dora Act, or Defence of the Realm, where anything that could be a cause of concern was suppressed by the government. However, it wasn't entirely successful, because by June and July over in the UK, British newspapers were reporting the enormous deaths of people in the services and also running factories and coal mines. And obviously in the US, after a few months, you had that string of incredible, literally killer headlines where in 90-point bold announcements were made of the number of people who died that day in Chicago or Philadelphia or San Francisco. So governments were desperately trying to say, it's okay, it's not that bad, we've got it in control. And people were seeing for themselves that everybody in their street had got it and half their street had died. It's similar to the kind of peculiar balance we've had with this pandemic, where governments across the world are sort of trying to reassure their populations, work with scientists. The scientists are saying one thing, the governments are saying another, and sometimes ignoring them. But I suppose the other thing to bear in mind is, while all this was going on, while the newspaper headlines were out there, and people were aware that people in their district, in their village, in their town were dying, they didn't have the same global perspective that we do now. I can look at my phone and I can tell you that, there's been 5 million deaths from COVID on average, or I can say over 800,000 deaths from COVID in the US. People living in somewhere like Hucknall in Nottinghamshire, or even the East End of London, didn't have access to that kind of detail apart from the occasional newspaper. So in some more remote areas, there was a feeling of disquiet, but I don't think anybody had any idea of just how desperate the picture was.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, no, it is incredible. And you kind of you actually mentioned San Francisco. They had mask protests there, right?
They
did.
Can
you talk a little bit about that?
That was fascinating. What happened in San Francisco was, it was as now, it was quite a progressive city. So Mayor Rolfe instructed his citizens to wear the masks, and there was even a little rhyme about something like, obey the laws and wear the gauze, evade the claws of septic pores, something like that. But yes, and most people complied with it. If you wanted to get a ferry across the bay, you had to wear a mask. If you wanted to go on the, I think it's a tram in San Francisco, isn't it? You had to wear
the cable cars.
Yeah, wear a mask. Cable cars, that's it. Most people complied with this. They could see the virtue of it. There was even one couple, honeymooners, who said to their doctor shyly that they'd worn nothing else in bed for 2 weeks, but they'd worn their masks, which I think is so sweet. But not everybody thought it was sweet, and not everybody was compliant. So there was this redoubtable lady called Mrs. Harrington, and she was an attorney, which was very unusual in those days. She was one of the first women to join the San Francisco, Californian bar. So she was a lawyer. She was a suffragette, but she also claimed that wearing masks, being made to wear a mask, was unconstitutional. And she found Mask League. And at first, it started a tame way, quite a genteel way, at the Dreamland skating rink. They all met up and they said, well, I don't hold with this, I don't agree with this. And they were a mixture of people. There were local socialites, there were lawyers, there were do-gooders of various sorts, but there are also a few rebels among them. And so at first they said, what we should do is let's get a petition together and send it to the local government. Let's send it to the council saying we want the mask. We want masks to be repealed. We want to have to wear them at our own discretion. We do not think that they should be mandatory. So people sort of went along with that. And then gradually the tone became more violent and aggressive until December 1918, when an improvised explosive device was sent to government offices. And it just came with a note saying, love from John. So nobody identified themselves. But you can imagine, an IED sent to a civilian office, pretty terrifying. Fortunately, it didn't go off, and it's just as well, because it was packed with a clock, gunpowder, and various bits of shrapnel. So, there were people who were prepared to kill other people because they didn't want to wear a mask.
Right.
So frightening, and with a number of, parallels.
Very much.
Yeah.
I mean, on social media, anti-masker, pro-masker, anti-vaxxer, pro-vaxxer, a lot of these disputes are probably the same things happening in 1918, and I think you're seeing it now. This disease in 1918 had 3 successive, increasingly worse waves. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The first wave was kind of early spring of 1918. Second wave, roughly, although accounts of this vary, summer, early autumn. And then the worst and most vicious wave was around October and November. And sadly, one of the reasons that the November wave was so lethal was the armistice. So on November 11th, the armistice was signed between Britain and Germany, saying that, okay, that was it. The war was over. Germany lost. Obviously, people wanted to celebrate. So they poured into town squares everywhere. That they poured into places like Times Square in New York, Albert Square in Manchester. The armistice celebrations were responsible for setting off a lethal wave of Spanish flu. Sorry, there are things distracting me here. Right.
It's okay. It's okay.
A lethal wave was triggered in New Zealand, a mixture of the armistice celebrations and troops coming back to New Zealand who'd been serving abroad. So while everybody was getting there to celebrate the fact that the war was over, and they were literally dancing in the streets, getting drunk, having sex in parks, all of it, while all this was going on, the lethal virus was spreading among them. So within 2 weeks of the armistice, the infection rates and the death rate had risen.
Right. So it gets worse and worse. And one of the interesting, your approach was to really look at these individuals. You talked about Harrington and San Francisco, but you include Mary McCarthy, Steinbeck, Roosevelt, David Lloyd George, and their experiences. I mean, what was it like kind of trying to get that? You really have a global view. What was it like doing that research to uncover all those personal stories?
I looked at all sorts of things. I looked at existing material, interviews which had already been recorded. With the cases of famous people, I thought of all the people like Lloyd George, for instance, or Mary McCarthy, who'd been around at the time. And I thought, right, I'll get hold of their biographies and I'll see if they experienced anything of it and what they said. So that led in one direction. And I went to the Imperial War Museum in London and looked through their files. And I found kind of letters home, postcards and diaries, people who'd served in, soldiers who'd served in France, for instance, and written about being taken ill suddenly and having to hide in a hay barn and go through the horrors of Spanish flu all on their own for a couple of weeks before recovering, being able to rejoin their regiment. There was a lot of material out there, but I was also keen that I wanted to have a balance of ordinary people's lives, people who weren't famous, but who'd survived it. And again, I found these records at the Imperial War Museum, various other libraries. I was really glad that this was before the pandemic, otherwise it would have been very, very difficult to research.
Right.
And of course, there are a lot of news resources online. There are a lot of old newspapers online. So you only have to flick through and you'll find some terrible, tragic human story, like I think an Italian man in New York who completely lost it because a kind of mental breakdown often accompanied the symptoms of Spanish flu. And he became completely deranged and killed his family. This happened a lot, sometimes because people thought, we're all going to starve to death, what's going to happen to us? But also because the air hunger, the lack of oxygen, could bring on a form of dementia where people went mad, basically, and killed other people or killed themselves. So if you know what to look for, you can find it. Obviously, for a modern researcher writing about COVID, there is already so much material out there that it would be a question of deciding what to leave out rather than what to put in.
Right. Right. And so you had all these kind of personal stories. Mary McCarthy herself, you found out she had it really bad.
Yes, she had an awful time because both her parents died. Her father was a bit of a weak aesthete, playboy type. It's not very PC. It's not very woke, but he was what they used to call a milk toast. And he was heading back to stay with the family, and he contracted it. his wife contracted it. I think one or two of her siblings also died. But Mary McCarthy was then, in her memoir of a Catholic girlhood, she writes about it, she was then brought up by a rather harsh and loveless aunt, having lost her family to this appalling condition. In fact, the best bit of her memoir is when they are heading east to go back to the family because her father's basically broke and useless. And it becomes obvious that the entire family is riddled with Spanish flu, and the conductor wants to put the family off the train in the middle of nowhere, some prairie in the middle of nowhere where they would obviously just have died. And Mr. McCarthy Sr., the milquetoast, actually pulls a gun on him and says, "You will not put us off the train." So they did make it back to his parents' house, but only just. They had to be lifted off the train, and they died a couple of days later.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, so just like whole families just wiped out. Some survivors, and you actually include a piece in your book about exhuming some of, like, they're wanting to find out what happened back there. The modern scientists. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a British professor called Professor John Oxford, whose life's work has been attempting to, it sounds a bit creepy, but bear with me. His life's work has been attempting to exhume corpses to enable his team to find out what the actual DNA was in the HN151 virus.
H1N1.
Yeah, that killed them. And unfortunately, so far, and he is in his 80s now, he's not been successful because the bodies have not been well enough preserved. So he went up to the extreme north of Norway to look at bodies there, bodies of miners who'd died of Spanish flu, who perhaps could yield some useful DNA, but they'd been packed in permafrost, and so they weren't sufficiently well preserved. To be disgusting about it, it's like if you put a pack of sausages in the freezer and don't freeze them properly, and they come out inedible and squishy. He also looked at corpses in Alaska, the same result, and a very famous man, I'm just trying to, part of the, is it the Scott-Picot agreement?
Sykes-Picot. Mark Sykes?
Sykes-Picot, yes.
Yeah.
He looked at the body of the guy from the Sykes-Picot agreement, and
Mark
he thought,
Sykes.
this would really yield a useful amount of material, because he'd been buried in a lead coffin. But sadly, even in this case, there wasn't sufficient DNA material there to work with. So this is something that scientists are still pursuing.
Right, with biohazard kits,
Yeah.
and more. I mean, they're afraid of what could come out of that. We're at about 33 minutes, Catherine. Do you mind taking just a couple questions?
No, that's fine. I'm happy to.
Okay. There's one from Faki. Says, I read a percent of deaths related to 1982 was in part due to overuse of aspirin. Do you write about this in your book?
Not in any great detail, but I am aware that that was a problem, because, of course, people were taking aspirin to bring down their temperature. Really, the drugs you had recourse to at that time were very limited. And their doctors were saying to them, yes, take aspirin, it will bring your temperature down, you'll feel better. Of course, they didn't realize that a large amount of aspirin is likely to affect your stomach and cause internal bleeding. And I think this may have actually been the reason that one of the women I do write about in it died. Her name was Mabel, and she already had Spanish flu, but her son was home on leave, and she was determined to go to the theatre with him that night. So she took a lot of aspirin and died 2 days later. She may have just died of Spanish flu, but it's also that she may have hemorrhaged as a result of aspirin abuse.
So so they were trying to apply some drugs to this problem. Yeah, I see. And there was another question from Arnold. He says, did you come across any historical equivalents to the pandemic denier tropes we see today?
That's a really good question. Not so much a denier, but people blaming it on various things. For instance, in South Africa, some members of the population blamed it on the fact that South Africa had not gone in with the Germans in the Boer War, that they'd fought on the side of the British. This is thought to be God's wrath. The black natives in South Africa blamed it on the whites and said, they haven't been taking care of us. They brought it with us. In British India, under the Raj, many Indian nationalists quite rightly felt that they'd not been well served and that Indians had not been looked after or cared for correctly. And one of the nationalists in a newspaper at the time said, they treat us, they leave us to die like rats. So you could hardly be surprised when a couple of decades later, Indian nationalism appeared. So there are a number of sort of blame games going on. One of the most horrific was parts of Russia and Poland, where, a tired old trope, they blamed the Spanish flu on the Jews, thereby opening up that already existing damaging anti-Semitic tendency. Pogroms were already happening, but kind of opening it up towards the Holocaust a couple of decades later. People were trying to find an explanation. They couldn't believe that just one tiny virus could be responsible for wreaking havoc across the entire globe. Now, of course, unfortunately, we know better. We realize that can happen.
Right. And this book really does tie into today in so many different ways. Where's the best place for people to get Pandemic 1918? Well,
you can get it on Amazon, but I'd also like to see people buy it from independent bookshops in hardcovers. It's an audio book. It comes in various formats. As long as you buy it, read it, borrow it, get it from the library, which is always great because libraries make reading more accessible to everybody. I just think it's important that it gets out there and that people understand some of the things that were happening at that period and how they've influenced what's going on now.
Very much so. Very much the culture, the response, the gravity of the situation, the effect on people. Like the effects of this pandemic are maybe not as bad as 19, but the sociological, psychological effects are important to understand, and they'll reverberate just like Pandemic 1918 did too. So excellent job. Thanks for coming on the show. Again, the title of the book, awesome. Just the full title of the book again is Pandemic 1918, Eyewitness Accounts from the Greatest Medical Holocaust in Modern History by Catharine Arnold, published 2018 in the States. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, stay there. All right, stay there. That was perfect. That's 30